Welcome. Hi, this is Mike Furlong. In July 6th, you're making a presentation at the International School Psychology Association meeting in Bologna, Italy. Very excited about that. And at ISPA, unfortunately, the presentation sessions are rather brief. The oral presentations are just 15 minutes. So I have more information I'd like to share with you today. So if you happen to have gone to the presentation, or will be going to, because I'm recording this ahead of time, I provided more detailed information here so you could follow up on the information I presented at the conference. If you didn't have a chance to go to ISPA and you still would like to see some of this information, I've made it available. So I'm going to do a little presentation today that shares with you some information about how we've been adding assessment information to the California Healthy Kids Survey that focuses more on their positive well-being as opposed to searching for pathology, as we often do. We're concerned, rightfully, about depression, anxiety. And but this tries to take a look at the students and how they're doing well. The picture you see right there is Santa Barbara Mission, and this last winter we happened to get a little bit of snow on our mountains, which is rather pretty. So the information I'm going to talk to you about today was taken from responses that you can see there. A large number of students, over 500,000 students from California, completed the California Healthy Kids Survey in 2021-22 school year. And in that was the first time that we had added life satisfaction measures. You can see the BMLSS right here. I'll be sharing with you for the first time, I think, norm information about this. There's never really been a large sample like this. They were able to look at, well, how do students respond to this? So I'll share with you that. And then we also have a distress measure that we have. We call it the social emotional distress scale. I'll show you those two. They're brief. They're just 5 items each. So these are our attempt to try to efficiently add a way that we can create an index about students' overall social emotional wealth, their well-being, so we can take a look at the joint distribution. Oftentimes we really don't have that available, and we can look at that in the sort of a way to interpret that. So I'll show you several different ways you can do that for research purposes or for general screening, or as I like to think about it, how can we take this so we can actually apply it like to a real human being, to a student, not an anonymous student, like we do in some of our surveillance surveys. So these are the 2 items sets. The BMLSS there, the brief multidimensional life satisfaction scale, was developed by Scott Eubner at the University of South Carolina. Scott's been a real pioneer and a leader in assessing life satisfaction and wellness in students for many, many, many years, way before it was popular and way before positive psychology even came onto the landscape. This is his brief version. It's built on a longer version that he has. In the longer version, each of these domains of life satisfaction that encompass aspects, important aspects of a young person's life, had more items to it. To create the brief version, he just asked about these different domains and asked students their life satisfaction over that. I'll show you how we've been doing that. The social emotional distress scale is a measure that asks about more recent experiences past month. It's one that we developed at UCSB, and you can see generally it's like so many other of our internalized screening measures. It kind of asks some questions that kind of focus on students' worries, right, and maybe their sadness. So let me show you that. So this is what we did, and we have these 500,000 students who respond to these surveys. Let's see what they provided to us. This picture right here is a picture of the harbor in Santa Barbara on a beautiful winter day we had this last year. So the access to this information comes from a resource we have in California. The Department of Education and WestEd, in collaboration, have established a system for administering and scoring and reporting back to the schools, what we call in California the California Healthy Kids Survey. They call it the Cal School Survey because there also are measures for teachers and parents to assess their overall perception of climate, and how the students are developing. There's primary schools or middle school and high school. This is a portal they've created using Qualtrics online survey. The kids go in here, they click on it, and then they can take the survey. That's in the context. If you think about it, first, I'm going to talk about the life satisfaction part. Scott Eubner here telling us that life satisfaction is kind of an overview of how anybody, but from a youth perspective, how they view their life, how they're developing a sense of who they are in the world that they're in. So it's a cognitive evaluation. It's not emotional. It's a cognitive judgment, them experiencing life, looking at the aspects of their life and saying, how is it going? Is this a satisfying existence that I have? They're enduring, so as they form, they solidify, and they create a sense of who they are, and that's not just subject to momentary experiences they might be having. You can make judgments, Scott believes, about major different domains for life. In other words, you quite frankly could have a wonderful school life, but maybe at school the teachers don't treat you, and you might have different appraisals of what school, family life, or peer life might be. And these tend to be non-transitory. So if you track them over time, they will be correlated from time 1 to time 2 and so on. There's benefit to looking at life satisfaction in and of its own, because research has shown that when people provide information about their generalized overview of life satisfaction, it adds understanding to what their life experiences is above and beyond other measures. So, and it's also predictive of better health outcomes, having more energy and engagement, having stronger social skills, and is negatively related with experiences like depression or suicidal ideation. So there's value in looking at this on its own. The other thing is research longitudinally has shown that a person's sense of life satisfaction at point 1 is predictive of better outcomes at point 2, or lower depression and that type of thing. So there's value in and of itself to look at this. And, you know, for many years, we haven't included these types of informations in our surveillance survey. We ask lots of information about drugs students are using or binge drinking. They need that information, but we haven't asked them, you know, how is your life going? Is it going okay? So these are the items. This is a screenshot here of what the students see when they are on Qualtrics. You can see here we have a button that they can click. If they can take the survey in Spanish, they have options to do that. This is what the online format is like. So in Qualtrics, I would describe my satisfaction with, and you can see each of the domains, and the students select the response that they have. I want to point here that we decided to use a response survey that matched the construct, their sense of satisfaction. Originally, Scott, back in the 1990s, had a response scale that kind of looked like this. This was taken from one item life happiness measure that was used in the mid 1970s. And so this is really more like, you can see the terms happy are already in there. So it's more not, at least in our view, focusing more on life satisfaction. But the other view was, we're asking parents, in many cases, we ask them their permission to have their students take the survey. And of course, in any of these cases, the students have the option to take the survey or not. They can opt out of it without any consequences. So, but we've never really felt comfortable saying to parents, we're going to ask your child if they think their family life is terrible. That's a judgment in our view. It's not a reflection of the person's experience. If they feel they're dissatisfied with life, their family life, at least gives the idea that there might be some opportunity to help the student or the family make it better. So anyways, those are the items. The students answer them. And I'm going to highlight a couple of things here. And those are 2 answers for satisfied, very satisfied. If you stop and think about it for a moment, how would you want your child to answer this question? Or your grandkids or students in your class? If you ask them how satisfied are you with your family life, parents, I presume, and we've asked, generally say at least satisfied. Even a little satisfied doesn't sound sufficient when you're thinking about what's optimal for students. So see this here. So later you'll see we look at students satisfied or very satisfied responses as a positive indicator that things are kind of generally going in that well, and we use that as a way to then later set up an index. And so put that pin in your hat there, so to speak, and I'll get back to that. So we've done confirmatory factor analyses on this now with a randomly selected subsample of 22,100 students across gender identities, sexual identities, ethnic identification, and whatnot. You can see this is a broad representation of California, 113 schools, many of the counties. But in any case, we've done a factor analysis, and what we're finding, at least initially, and this may change because we're going to be writing a paper on this, so be looking for that if you have an interest. But the items all load well on it. But the question is it a unidimensional measure that just measures life satisfaction? You can see that there's correlations, as you can imagine, pop up between the items. Students who tend to answer the questions, for example, with friends in school, high, tends to answer both of them high. So we don't think this is a problem because it's really the combination of all of them. But the CFI and RMSI are okay, but the in the SMR is fine, but RMSA is a little low. So we're looking into this further, but we think still this doesn't preclude from using a total score or counting the number of strengths. And we think that's applicable across different groups of students, but we're continuing to look at that. But now we actually can, for the first time, presented here on planet Earth with a truly large sample of students, over 500,000. Here's the distribution of students responsive to it, at least in California. How that's representative for your community probably would be a matter that you'd want to scrutinize, but here at least gives us an idea of how students in our diverse sample of students in California responded. You can see 50% over here. So most of the students are answering higher, they're satisfied generally with their life, and you'll see some more information on that in a second. You can see down here the 0, and I think that is related to when we use our online surveys. Students click the zeros down. We've taken a better look at these. These look like students who may have just put 0 on their responses just to kind of get through the survey. So whenever we're doing this, if we're using these types of things in screening in schools, for example, you ought to keep that in mind, as some of the students may not have taken the survey with the level of thoughtfulness and sincerity that we might have imagined. But anyway, you have this information. We now can assign T-scores to this, which was never available before. Our hope is maybe this will provide some standards so that when people publish studies, they would have a common base to compare it to, so that you could better understand where students in different locales who might have used the B missile compare to each other. This gives you an idea of the distribution of the specific responses for each of the items. The highest rated satisfaction items with where people live. This might not, and hey, it's California, but not all of California is ideal. But generally, students, that was their, you can see 78% said that they were satisfied or very satisfied. That should be satisfied. Satisfied, mildly satisfied. Yeah, okay, satisfied. And you can see here family, friends, and then not so much school. So this is why we use this with the schools, because it gives us, rather than just saying, oh, the students are satisfied or dissatisfied with life, it provides a little bit more information to zero in. So if a counselor is following up or working with the students, it would give them at least just a little hint at some domains in their life to explore to see how the student is responding. And of course, sadly, the students rate themselves the lowest. Okay, so those are that. And this shows you the percentage. Remember, pay attention to very satisfied and satisfied. This is the percentage of students out of 500,000 who said satisfied or very satisfied. So generally, 3/4 are satisfied with where they live, their family and friends. Less so with respect to themselves and school. So now we switch to the emotional distress items. So those now we can co-norm. So the first time in the history of the planet, we have a efficient items that measure life satisfaction and distress that are co-normed with each other. So we can see the joint distribution. You'll see that later because that's important for how we might use this in surveillance or in clinical work with students. So this is the screenshot for the Qualtrics survey for the SEDS items. And you can see it's set up the same way. Students can take it in another language. They're asking about the past 30 days. And the students rate them on not true, a little true, pretty much true, and very much true. We've done research on this. We've published papers on it. So before we used this in California, we actually piloted it with over 100,000 students and did an analysis to see that the measure had the requisite psychometric characteristics that we were seeking before we then have added it, we hope permanently, to the survey that students throughout California take. So you can see that. So this is backed up like that. And again, we pay attention to the two highest ratings. So if a student is experiencing distress, like how much distress? Everyone's going to have some distress in their life, but how much might you say, well, no, I would consider that a distress. So I've had a hard time relaxing. If students are saying pretty much true or very much true, let me kind of think, well, let's use that as an index. That in that one item right there, they're saying, yeah, this isn't going so well this past month. So keep that in mind. We'll show you how we're using that in a joint distribution analysis. And again, with the SEDS, we've done CFAs on it. We've replicated them. This is with a large sample of over 10,000 in the original study and a follow-up where we had the 2,100 students randomly selected, high loadings on all of them, good fit statistics overall, the correlation between, and we've looked at the correlation between the B missile and the SEDS, which is 0.47, so pretty substantial. And we've actually followed up with the SEDS with some students to see how stable their monthly reports of stress were, and they're actually pretty steady even over a couple of years. So the students who are tending to have some distress might be carrying it forward. And this is how the students responded to them and which ones were the least troubling for the students, hard time getting excited, and the most often they reported some distress was hard time relaxing and irritated, which might not be, we have to think about it because of course this information was being collected in the midst of the COVID-19 restrictions that were going on in California. This shows you the percentage of students who answered pretty much true or very much true in the past month. See, most of the students are not reporting that they're experiencing these things, but again, most frequently 33%, 41% are kind of these sad and down, relaxing, being easily irritated. And now again, we can give you the distribution, we can give you T-scores. So if you're using this and administering with a student, you can actually go to this to the extent that you decide that these 500,000 students provide a reasonable index of what students' responses are here. You can get a T-score from this and use that in your work. So now, so we have that now, we've got that set up. We'll be publishing a paper that provides an overview of the psychometric papers of both of those things. So there'll be a standard that people could refer to the extent it might be helpful. And we want to turn our attention to like now, how do you use this data rather than an anonymous survey? If you administer this with students, how would you know whether they were use that as an index, if you will? Well, there's different ways you could approach this. So the first I want to just talk about, there's a traditional approach. We call it the traditional metric. It's a sum approach. So in other words, if you had two measures like this, you can combine the scores on the two and look at the joint distribution so that you had low would be an indication that the students were not doing well social emotionally, health, and the high scores being well. So there's a way to do this, and this is what we usually do. This is a traditional approach. And you can see like how you can do that. So you can see the original distress score. So the scores there, remember, we scored them from 0. So 0 to 3, 4-point scale. Total scores could go from 0 to 15. But of course, 15 is a high score. So to make a combined score, what we've got to do is we have to reverse so that the 0 in this case actually represents a high distress and 15 represents low distress. So you had to flip that around to combine the two. So you have 0 to 25, 0 to 5, 6-point response on this B missile, the life satisfaction. So the scores could range from 0 to 25. This is high life satisfaction, that's low. So now you can combine the two now. A student who's very high on life satisfaction and very low or high on, if you switched it around, high on distress, except 15 now, low, you'd combine the two scores. And then you'd have a score that went from 0, where the students had the maximum of distress and the minimum of life satisfaction, to 40, where the students had the minimum of distress and the maximum life satisfaction. So you get a 0 to 40 distribution. And we could do that now. I can show you the distributions on these from 0 to 40 and just kind of convince you, is this work at all as maybe an index? And I would say, yes, it does. So just here, for example, students in the United States are asked on the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance Survey, and we use that in the Healthy Kids Survey about past year feeling chronic sadness. So it's supposed to be the depression indicator that they use in the US. So it's just answered yes or no. So it's a binary. So it fits perfectly to do a receiver operating characteristic analysis on this to see how well that 0 to 40 index predicts students' responses to that binary yes, no, feeling sad in the past year. And you could see the area under the curve here is 0.86. This is very good. It is associated with that. You can see here, these are the raw numbers of students out of 500,000 that said yes. The dark columns there are the number of students who said yes, I had sadness, in the past year. And here's other students who said no. So you can see there's a strong correlation here. Of course, we notice even students who have high life satisfaction may be experiencing sadness in the past year. So we have to keep that in mind. But what do we do here? We create a binary world in psychology. We love to put people into one category or the other, one diagnostic category or the other. So what do we do with this? We create a cut point, and that's what the ROC curve would allow us to do. Look at sensitivity, specificity. We would pick a point here and we'd say, oh, these students are at high risk. We're going to use that as our indicator. So you could do this and you'd have reasonable justification, I say, to back this up. There's not a lot of measures that we out there that actually have our AOC on receiver operating characteristics for something like this. It's 0.86 or higher. So that's not unreasonable. And this is over a large sample of students. And this is just to reinforce this idea. This is the same question, but predicting past years, seriously suicidal ideation. So if we're screening for these things, this measure used in this way could provide an index about students who might be vulnerable to these serious mental health indicators in their life. One could do that. But this is my warning, and this is to offer you some different ways to think about using information like this, because we are using these tools that we have here, but the same thinking about this could be applied to other methods, okay? So the warning here is that when we do the 0 to 40 total score standard traditional way of doing it, looking for cut points, that actually doesn't acknowledge that there aren't 41 possible response patterns. In fact, there's 416 unique response patterns. But when you do the traditional method, you reduce those to only 41 specific values. There's value in those values, and that, as you could see from the distributions to suicide and chronic sadness, they are related to that. But the issue here, when you're using this with a particular student and you want to understand their needs, you can see here, life satisfaction from 0 to 25. I flipped the scores around on the SIDS. So you could see here, student was low, but got 15 points on the distress, and the highest on life satisfaction. That's the highest score. And down here, just the opposite. So this area here is more optimal in terms of students' mental health. This area down here is suboptimal. So you can kind of see this, but I've shaded in these to show you that the 0 to 41 produces multiple response patterns that have the same value. Look at all of these that are at 25 and all of these that are at 20. The point I want to make here is this, is that, as you can see, this student, young person here, answered that they had the highest life satisfaction, but they had the lowest, most amount of distress in this area. Those students who had a value of 25 are markedly different than the students down here who had a below average life satisfaction and high, but very low levels of distress. So you can see clinically, if you're working with a student, to know that their value had a value of 20 doesn't really tell you much, because you want to know, well, how did they get to that 20? So if you're using this for a particular student, it makes more sense to actually look at the students when you look this matrix array approach, to look at where the 20 value came from in the distribution to better understand what the student's needs are. Let me illustrate. So I actually did that for the 500,000 students. And so here is the actual raw number of students who fall into all of those 416 categories. So I'm not going to get in all the detail here, but I'm just showing you, here is a way you could do this. If you have a group, your district, your community, your governmental region, you could use these measures. You could actually see, well, how many students are in each category, rather than going to the 0 to 40. And you can see these are the needs of students in the array are different. So you can do that. The numbers there are large. I just want to make this more accessible to you. So if you had a school with 1,000 students in it, and you had the same proportions of students in each of these 416 cells that matched how the California sample of 500,000 students responded, here's the actual raw number of students you would have. So if you had a school of 1,000, here's the number of students that would fall if they were close to what we have in California. And you can see most of the students are up in this realm, over this zone over here. 46, that's optimal. The suboptimal, there's only one. So these aren't, a lot of students aren't responding to this way. And you can see they're spread out over many areas. So doing this approach, and I'll show you in a second, is another way that you can do this to try to track students' wellness. So that's a matrix. The point there was to make that you can combine the two scores in a traditional way. You might use it that way, but another approach is to think of this not as like a continuum that goes from 0 to 40, but look at the combination, the matrix, the array of student responses that help you understand the zone where the students' responses are falling. And I want to talk about, so this is asking about, this is the full matrix array approach I was thinking about. So there's an approach to then looking at that array and then interpreting within it. And I'm going to talk about what I call the single node approach. And then I'm going to talk about a 4-node normative approach, and then a 4-node criterion scoring, which is really where we're headed. And we think it's the simplest to use. It doesn't require any high technical skills or access to technology. And it's something that parents and teachers and students and others might just have an intuitive understanding of. We hope. That's our idea. That's, you judge whether we're going in the right direction or not. So Shannon Suldo, of course, has done, who was Scott Eubner's student at University of South Carolina, has this approach. And this is from Greenspoon and Stafsowski's original study on this that looked at the dual factor model. I call it the single node model because in interpreting this, Shannon and others, including myself, have done studies where they've then applied basically a dual cut point, if you will. You get a cut point for where the student is with respect to subjective well-being, life satisfaction, is it high or low? And with respect to symptomatology, is it high or low? And when you do that, basically you're just applying 2 cut points to the matrix. And I call it the single node because what becomes critical is where the conjunction of those 2 that then define 4 different groups, which people have talked about as being complete mental health or troubled, basically. And then you have these, I guess, a little bit counterintuitive measures. These are students who have very low symptomatology, but their life satisfaction is very low. These students might have high life satisfaction, but low symptomatology and or both, right? Their life satisfaction side, but they're also experiencing the distress in their life. So so this is how this research is done. The problem with this research is they've never had a way to define these in a normative way. So everybody just uses their sample to define where those cut points fall. And that's really not a satisfactory solution. So our approach with this, we hope, also provides a standard way if people want to do a dual factor related research, they would have some standard that would be applicable across all studies. Now, we think the single node approach is not adequate. I don't have time to go into all of this here. So we've proposed what we call a 4-node dual factor model. And we have a chapter that we've written, an extensive chapter that goes all the way through this. It also provides a sort of summary of the dual factor approach and a discussion of what we think the advantages and disadvantages of that approach are. And I've included a copy of this. I'll show you at the end. I have links on the our website that has access to this chapter. So if you wanted to follow up and see more about this and explore this more, you can do that there. And this is the basic idea behind it. So in the dual single node approach, you would define a high and low area for life satisfaction and distress. And then you would get a single node. You would then define 4 groups, mental well-being groups, based upon where they fell in respect to that node. So what we proposed was, well, you know, perhaps we need to just provide additional divisions. You know, how high does life satisfaction need to be to call it high? How high does distress have to be called it high? And is there a middle ground? So basically what we did was we thought, you know, you can generally kind of think about it as like maybe going, putting quartiles on here. So you can have the lowest quartile and then a middle area and then a higher area. So that's kind of what we proposed. And we identified, I won't go into detail, but that chapter I have goes greater detail explaining this if you have interest to follow up. But then you have basically, if you have 2 cut points, then, well, you don't have 1 node, you have 4. So you have 4 nodes defining not just 4, but defining 9 zones that a student's responses might fall in. So this is was our approach to try to, you could use the full matrix, but to provide areas so that you're not dealing with 416 cells, but you're dealing with a lower number of cells, basically 9, but they that fall into these different comparative response patterns for distress, A, B, C. We did that because in schools, at least in the United States, A's are good grades, B's not so good, and C's are average. And this kind of relates to that. So this is the general approach of that. That book chapter provides a lot more detail on this. This is one approach you could use too. You could use those 10 items and you could use them to then look at where students fall in this particular array. And that chapter we have describes that, describes the materials you need to do that, and provides the information to do that. To give you an idea if this matters or not, and you could do this in your own jurisdictions that you work in, for the 500,000 students that we looked at it. Let's take a quick look, for example, how the students responded to the past year's suicidal ideation. And in California, 18% of the students, of those students said in the past year, they had seriously thought about suicide. So we could go into our matrix now, and you could do this in your school or your jurisdiction if you wanted the same way. And we said, well, how many of these students who were in this more optimal zone reported that? Well, you can see the percentages over here. They're almost nobody, 1%, 2%, 3%. Then if we go to the not suboptimal zone, we can see what percentage of students over here. So this is kind of a validation look at this, because we'd expect, well, if students' responses throughout the distribution, the joint distribution of these made any sense, you would expect lower rates of symptomatic behaviors over here and much higher over here. And in fact, you can see that, and you can see it's amazing how the distribution is so consistent, going down, but you see not up and down, but going at an angle, a diagonal, lower over here, very low here. The green there shows you the students who are close to that 18%. So it almost kind of provides zones, you see, of students who are reporting much lower symptomatology and students who are reporting much higher. So this is a way to try to say, does this approach have some validation? Also, we think it does. And we could go on and on like this. I won't do it here in detail, but here's the same thing for asking about students' sadness. You can do it for positive things too. You could say, what about students' sense of hope or optimism? So there's many different ways you could explore, well, how are students' responses on this screening measure related to other aspects of their life, both symptomatic and perhaps their positive development. The other exciting thing, at least we think, if you had this, you now can track the students. You don't have to have any technology, or you don't have to have any calculations of numbers or anything. As you can see up here, I put in this version of the array, the matrix, the t-scores that are associated with the life satisfaction and the t-scores associated. So from a clinical perspective, you can use this. You can see here's the t-scores are in the 60, 70, 80. These are zones where traditionally you'd go, oh, we need to follow up on these students. And the same here is like, how low does life satisfaction need to be before you go, oh, we need to follow up on those students. But without deciding on cut points or anything, you could say, for example, if a student, when you started working with them, was responding in this way, you could note where they were. You don't have to make a judgment. You don't have to place them in a category. You don't have to call them anything. You don't have to label them in any way particularly. But you're clear now, you know, well, where do we want to go? Well, you want the student, hopefully in the future, to report higher life satisfaction and fewer distresses. Well, to do that, the student would have to move in this direction. So you could use this if you're working with a student to do time 1, time 2, time 3, and you actually could have a explicit picture of the progress teacher that the student was making, that was understandable to the parents, to teachers, and to everyone, without having to deal with t-scores or explain what a t-score is, and so on and so forth. So this is an approach. You could use this viable. That book chapter provides more detailed information about how you might want to do that. So there is another approach. So that's kind of a normative approach in a way, but you could do a criterion approach. Like you could say, well, how many of the life satisfaction items do you have to answer satisfied or very satisfied for us to say you're satisfied? And how much distress do you have before we might want to think that you have distress? So it's not relative to the distribution of everybody. It's kind of like saying, no, here's the criterion we set for answering these questions in a way that we think they're representative of good things like life satisfaction, and they're representative of some things we'd be concerned about, like the student's experience of distress. So this is kind of where we've gone in California to create an index, one that we think is more understandable to educators that we're dealing with. So again, to go back, this is a screenshot of the BMLSS life satisfaction skills again. So you can then, can we just kind of turn this into a binary? I know I said don't go into a binary world, but we'll go back and do it for just a second here. And we could say, yes, satisfied or very satisfied is our criterion for being a minimally minimal indicator that the student's life is going well in that area. So you can turn it into that. And you can see a student could answer these items in this way. So they could have 0, 1, 2, 3, and you can see there's 1, 2, 3. 3 of the items would be considered meeting that criterion. Okay. Hang with me on that. Now, of course, you could say, well, how many of those 500,000 students answered? How many had, whoops, let me go back, had 0, 1, 2, 3. Well, this is the percentage of that 500,000. 48% said 4 or 5. And you can see all the way down, but even 8% said none. So if I was working in a school and I had a screening of students and I found students who had said none of these, clearly, if you're trying to look at some criteria, well, how do I know who to follow up with? Well, probably this is a pretty good indicator of that. 18% of the students, you'd want to follow up with those students. That's just an example of that. And you do the same for the distress measures, right? So this is our criterion. This is our binary. Now we have a student answers in this way, only one of the items in their area. So our distress measure here is 3 and 1. Now, how do we make use of this information? Well, you can see the percentage here. Most students say none. If you're trying to use some screening of an index for school, you might say, well, students who answer 4 or 5, pretty much for very much for even better follow-up, or you move incrementally, like you follow up with these students and you follow back towards the front. So of course, what you can do is actually create a matrix out of this. So let me skip ahead on this for a second. You can make a matrix. So here's how you'd make a matrix on this. So you can see you have distress measures. And this is the same as the 416 array. Now it's just down to 6 possible answers. So instead of having 416 cells, we have 36. And if you further break it down, because we're trying to make this as simple as possible, we can say, well, 0 to 1 distress is okay. 4 and 5, that's high and mid. So you can then break these down into low, mid, and high areas, just descriptively. And if you did that, lo and behold, we're back to our 4-node sort of interpretive framework. And those then define areas of optimal and suboptimal mental health, if you will. So this is an index that anyone can use, and it reduces it to 9 cells that we think are easily interpretable and understandable by people. So if you remember, if you did the item count with that one case, so the example that we had where a student had 3 on life satisfaction and 1 on distress, they would kind of fall into this mid-low zone. So probably if you're working in school, you wouldn't say, well, those are students of primary concern. Clearly, you'd want to know, well, the students who are low in life satisfaction and high on distress, yeah, those are the students that we'd want to follow up on. And if you look at our sample of 500,000 students, which we did, here's the actual percentage of students who then responses were in each of those 9 different cells of our array. So you could see this is where we're going. If you do this at a school, you could do this for all your students at your school. You could then place them into each one of these different categories. You'd actually see where your students, what types of students you're dealing with. And if you're using this year to year to year and you wanted to see progress, you'd kind of go, well, we're here 35, 45%. 45%, 55, about 60. Oh, 2 out of this is good. Can we get this up 5, 10%? So in other words, you actually could use this even if you're not monitoring specific students. Although I don't suggest that. When we work with schools, the students always enter an ID number so that the school staff care teams at school can follow up with real human beings and take care of them. But in other words, this could become an index that could be used to see how students are doing. And then another question you might have is, well, how does this relate? We've done this before, so probably you're going to go, it probably relates similarly, and it does. So in other words, you could also say from a validity point of view, the students in these cells look different on other variables that we would expect them to. And if you look at chronic sadness again, You can see the optimal area, only 8% of the students said they did that compared to 89% of the students here. So there is strong relationships here, and each of the cells offer a little bit different different risks related to these factors. But I do want to point out here one thing, and you'll notice over here that these don't go down as much as those with high distress. So one of the things that may not be real obvious here, but I'll make this point, is that what we found in doing to this, it's really important to look at life satisfaction and not just screen for distress. Why? Well, because students, life satisfaction, low life satisfaction is detrimental to students. High life satisfaction is protective for students. So we need to pay attention to both. Here's one that you can look at. I said before, you can look at positive things, so like school belonging. So here we ask students, I feel like I'm a part of this school. That's kind of a protective factor for students, right? So if you look at the students who said, yeah, I agree with that, I strongly agree. Well, you can see the percentage here, 70 versus 18. So that's the other part of this is if you add other information asking about the students, you can ask about risk and protective factors, and you can see which risk or protective factors might be not available to students who you might want to follow up with. So we think this provides, again, another way of validating this way of using the information. And our sense is this can be used as a population indicator of student wellness, but the real appeal to us is then the same 10 items could be used with an individual student and could be used to support their individual assessment or their counseling or personal development program. So just to let you know, so we actually use these in California. If you have an interest, the Healthy Kids Survey, West Ed, or the California Department of Education has a whole system set up. So you could follow up here at calschools.org. They have a dashboard that you can look at. The schools have a dashboard set up in Tableau, so the schools can actually go in and actually search for information and follow up about how the students at their school have been doing. So that's available. The other thing I want to point out is if you go to the website that we've set up, Co-Vitality ISPA info, go to presentations, it will bring you to this page. And this is where I posted information about the presentations at the ISPA conference. So there'll be a copy of these slides, that there'll be a video, this video will be posted there. And then I've created a new resource, which is a document that includes all of this information. So if you wanted to try using this with an individual student, it has the forms and it has all of the documentation and the scoring you would need to actually apply it, and these matrices that you could use to interpret. So please try that, and if you have any feedback on that, we'd appreciate it. We have other documents on that. We also have the book chapter. So this would be the book chapter that I talked about. So all those things I talked about here, there's a copy of them here that you can access to. And if you wanted to, there's another paper that will be posted here, and that is another look where we followed students during the COVID-19 pandemic and looking at their social well-being, and not surprisingly found that students' social well-being suffered substantially during the pandemic. So we have a paper presentation related to that. So I appreciate your visiting our website or looking at this presentation. I hope it was helpful. You can contact me there if you have questions or you have needs for more information. And thank you. Have a good day.